Section 1610, Acid-Base Behavior and Chemical Structure. This is another section like 16.9 that I would just de-emphasize. Very advanced and kind of to the side, I would think. You really, as you start understanding more and more and more, all of this falls together. The more you understand, the more things are obvious to you. The more you're trying to memorize, the harder stuff will be. So that's why this is not something I would like major on. I certainly wouldn't even put a test question on if I were giving tests for this. So in any case, let's go through it. What would determine whether or not something is going to give up a proton? It has to do with how strongly it's attached to what it's bound to. The stronger, the more attracted it is to what it's bound to, the less likely it's going to come off. The less that it's attracted to it, or the less that it's holding on to it, the weaker the bond, the more it's going to come off. So when you start thinking of chemistry as that, as logic, you just say, well, why does it come off, or why wouldn't it come off? Rather than trying to memorize whether it does or not. Just think about, well, would it come off? Would it not come off? That kind of thinking is really thinking, and that's where you want to go with any subject you study. You want to be able to know the stuff well enough that you could think through and say, well, does this make sense or not make sense? Okay, so let's look at it like that. First of all, you are not going to rip off a bond unless it's polar. If you're sharing the electrons dead on in the middle, then that they're both pulling on those electrons equally, then they're not going to come apart. They're both tied together with those electrons. If you're sharing the electrons unequally, then the more unequal the share, the easier it is for that hydrogen to come off. If you get to the point where it's actually ionic for some reason, now remember hydrogen doesn't form ionic bonds, it's covalent. But if you have a polar bond that's extremely polar, where the electrons are very close to the other side, it's easy for that hydrogen to come off. In that case, you're going to have, if the electronegativities are very far apart, then you're going to easily lose that hydrogen. And the more easily you lose it, the stronger the acid. Because a strong acid, remember, is getting rid of the hydrogen. The stronger the acid, the easier it is to get rid of the hydrogen. So you, first of all, need to have polar bonds. The second one, you want weaker bonds. The weaker those bonds, the less or the more likely that hydrogen's going to come off. The stronger the bonds, the more likely it won't come off. Okay, so the stronger that acid is for weaker bonds. Also, whether the base that's left over, the conjugate base, is stable. The more stable the conjugate base is, that means the more unstable the conjugate acid's going to be. And the more unstable it's going to be, the more likely it is to break apart. Do you see, if you study it from this way, it actually starts making sense. You're thinking it through rather than trying to remember all kinds of different facts about something that you can't even see. A couple of these other trends that you've learned in other chapters will make sense if you use them here. Okay, so let's go down a column. As you go down a column, the bonds are farther and farther apart. The element is bigger, and the bigger element can't crowd in close to the other one, and so the bond is farther away. The farther away that bond, the weaker it is. Just like two magnets held farther apart. The farther you hold a magnet, the weaker the attraction is. The closer you put it, the stronger it is. Well, if you want a strong acid, you want the hydrogen to be easily broken off, and you want the bond to be far away. So as you go down a column, you're going to get stronger and stronger acids. Okay? So if you were to have, say, group 7 acids, monoprotic acids like hydrochloric acid, hydrobromic acid, hydroiodic acid, all of those three are strong acids. Hydrofluoric acid is not a strong acid. Why? Because it has the highest electronegativity. It's being held so tight that it won't come off. And since it won't come off, it's not a strong acid. So these trends that you've learned over the various chapters start making sense if you think of them as just, duh, of course they won't come off because it's being pulled tight. rather than trying to learn something by rote. Okay? As you go across a row, the more that you're looking for is the polarity. How much is it unequally sharing the electrons? So the electronegativity rises as you go up towards fluorine. So as you go across a row, the farther to the right you go, the higher the electronegativity gets. Well, that means that the change from hydrogen, remember, is on the first column. As it gets farther and farther apart, it's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. Well, that means the farther it gets to the right, the farther apart the polarity is, and the easier it is for that hydrogen to break off. So these are, again, trends that you can kind of logically think through. Okay, I'm just going to lightly touch this. Oxyacids are acids where you've got a hydrogen attached to an oxygen. Normally, when a hydrogen is attached to a carbon, you've got a nonpolar bond and it's never going to break. But with an oxygen, you do have some polarity there. You do have polar bonds, and so you can easily, as long as you can somehow divert the strength of that pull by different tricks, you can get a hydrogen to come off. And so you can have acids that are called oxyacids, where it's just essentially a hydrogen-oxygen bond attached to some other thing. So as the nonmetal increases, the electronegativity, the acidity increases because it's easier to knock off that hydrogen. You want it to be more and more and more and more polar. So if you can play with the oxyacid in order to kind of change the strength of that oxygen-hydrogen bond, you can make something more or less acidic. And one way that you can do this is add more and more oxygens. The more oxygens you have, the greater the polarity is going to be, because it's not just the one oxygen pulling on the hydrogen, but it's all the oxygens in the neighborhood pulling on that hydrogen. And so since it's pulling, you're going to have such a strong polar bond there that it'll easily come off. It's just basically just hanging on by a thread, and anything can knock it off. And so remember, strong acid means easy to come off.